Welcome to Midnight's Edge. It's the new podcast for the darker side of comics. My name's Kevin, and I am located on the west coast of the U.S. With me is Andre.
Hey, me, it's Andre, and I'm in Norway.
So today, we're going to talk about Daredevil. This is the show that came out, just barely over a week ago, I suppose, but...
Yeah, the 10th of April.
Yeah, in this age of binge watching, though, it seems like people have gotten through it pretty quickly. I mean, I feel like it maybe kind of started this trend with House of Cards. Maybe that was where binge watching really took off. You know, the notion that a whole season could be released at once for the very first viewing. You know, it's not the second time through. It's not syndicated. It's the first time. But hey, it's all right there.
It's only could it be binge watched? It should be binge watched.
Yeah,
House of Cards was structured so that you really are expected to see the whole thing within 2 or 3 days, rather than 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months.
I mean, there's not only the addiction component to it, which is why they're calling it binge watching, but there's also, you know, the fact that there's minute details that might get lost in between episodes if you didn't watch it quickly. I mean, if you just watched it one a week, then wow, you'd be in trouble.
Exactly. Still, I think that Daredevil did a better job at it than the aforementioned House of Cards, since you actually can watch that on a weekly basis. It seemed to be structured so that, of course, there is plenty continuity from one episode to the next, but at the same time, you can take a break between at least most episodes without being completely lost.
Right, yeah, I've actually there's been a really good flow between, I mean, we have sat a couple days between episodes, my wife and I, and had no trouble getting back into it.
Yeah, same here. We also had, I think, as much as 2 days between 2 episodes, and it was no problem to carry on where we left off. But anyway, Kevin, what were you hoping for this show?
Well, just to give a little bit of background, I actually have not read tons of Daredevil. I mean, I've certainly read more of other characters. I've got the odd issue here and there. I mean, I've probably read maybe a dozen issues of Daredevil over the years, and I always thought the intriguing thing was trying to maintain normal relationships in what's a very violent scenario. You know, he's kind of trapped, locked into this goal of protecting Hell's Kitchen, but yet he's also got people who are very important to him and very cruel people after him. So I guess I was just expecting that violence to be portrayed, that fear of the worst happening. What were you expecting? What's your experience with Daredevil?
Well, I've read some of the more famous comic book runs. I've read the Miller runs, and I've read the Mack and the Bendis runs. Other than that, I haven't really read the entire series from start to finish, but I have read the seminal runs, the ones that really define the character. And to me, that is what Daredevil is. It's essentially what is distilled from the Miller, the Mack, and the Bendis runs. So I expected something that was more true to essentially the spirit of those runs, if not the letter of them. So something which is then more darker and deals with the struggle of essentially the working man, which is what you saw was really captured in this series as well, against the more corporate and the criminal elements of Hell's Kitchen, because it's really Hell's Kitchen specific. It's very located to that narrow area. It doesn't translate so much to California or anywhere else. At least that is my understanding as someone not living in America, but just reading the comics. That's the impression that I am left with from reading them. And I was kind of expecting that to come through in the series, this struggle of this very limited geographical area that Daredevil has appointed himself the guardian devil of.
Right, and that actually kind of ties into my overall impression of Daredevil too. I don't know, he is very much self-appointed, and I think that I kind of expect the character to be a bit of a doucher, you know, not necessarily in the whiny, irritating sense, but kind of, you know, unwantedly
aggressive. A bit
aggressive.
holier than thou.
Yes, absolutely, and that's actually I felt like that was done pretty well here.
I think that is something we're going to see more of later, because there I actually see quite a clear distinction between Daredevil in his own comics and in guest appearances in other comics, because of course he is a lawyer, so he is about the law first and foremost, and what he does at least from my understanding, is that he does what the law can't. He believes in the law, he believes in the system, but he also knows that the system isn't perfect. Things will fall through the cracks, and that is where Daredevil comes in. But at the same time, he doesn't recognize the methods of other characters in the Marvel universe, such as Spider-Man and most notably the Punisher. And I also know Daredevil from his guest appearances in the Punisher. And here they really amp up the holier-than-thou aspects of the character. And I think maybe we'll be seeing more of those in future seasons and in future Netflix series. But I think they struck a really good balance between him coming to terms with his own anger and doing things more or less within the confines of the law.
Mm-hmm. So I think when the most important thing to me here, I mean, the first thing you think about, I mean, as soon as you start seeing these images, these trailers, the first thing everybody's always talking about is how the character is looking compared to the comics version. So I suppose that's one way to tackle the actor's aspect of this. How do you feel Charlie Cox is as Daredevil?
I think he was excellent. I only saw him in that movie by Neil Gaiman. What's the name of it? Help me out here.
Oh gosh, I can't even remember.
Yeah, not measured.
I'm not sure I've ever seen Charlie Cox in anything before this.
No, he was in this movie, which was written by Neil Gaiman, and it's actually a great movie. It was released about 10 years ago when he was still in his early 20s. I'm going to do some package check, find the title right here. This is everyone, because it's a magical movie. Stardust from 2007. That was the first time I saw him, and he's excellent in the movie, but he's quite unlike Matt Murdock. So to begin with, I was a little bit apprehensive of his casting. I was like wondering, how does this really friendly, round-faced looking guy, how is he going to pull off Matt Murdock? How is he going to pull off the holier-than-thou attitude and the ferocity of Daredevil? But he really surprised me, because he actually is able to carry the show really well, in my opinion, and he gave a really nuanced, multifaceted performance where you see basically all the aspects that I wanted to see from the comics. You essentially get him as a victim, and because he's an orphan, he's grown up without his mother, his father died early, so he has basically gotten a rotten ticket in life, but he's made the best out of it. It didn't break him, it made him stronger. And it also made him righteous. And he captures all of this really well. He manages to balance his own internal anger with his own desire to see justice according to the law done. So I'm surprised he did really well. If only he had been ginger, everything would be perfect. But hey, you can't have everything.
Yeah, I suppose that's one side of it that I don't normally think about with Daredevil. I mean, it's almost like in popular culture they're trying to make him not ginger, because first you had Ben Affleck play him, another brunette, and then you've got Charlie Cox playing him, and it's like, well, maybe they see things like The Punisher, where you've got a character dyeing their hair jet black, and you sort of have to say, well, is the audience going to care?
I think 9 in 10 audiences are not going to care, but then you have the comic fan, and how many ginger superheroes are there?
Maybe not so many on the male side, but on the female side, a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. But still, I think it would be good for diversity in a sense if the gingers could have their one superhero remain ginger. But you can't have everything, and I think that Charlie Cox did such a great job that hair color is basically trivial. He really nailed it, and now I can't see anyone else taking on the part and doing it to the same level of perfection that he did. He's certainly much better than Ben Affleck, who did the role before, and of course Ben Affleck has grown considerably as an actor since, but at the time in 2003 when he starred in Fox Studios' Daredevil, well, that movie had issues, and he wasn't the first of those issues, but he was a part of the problem, essentially. The interesting thing, though, is that Ben Affleck wasn't the first Daredevil. The first Daredevil on screen is a little-known actor named Rex Smith, who played the character in the 1989 made-for-TV movie, Trial of the Incredible Hulk. And I recommend any Daredevil fan to check it out, because it really nails the blindness aspect of the character. And that is something that I felt actually lacking a little bit in this Netflix series. Of course, that is not Charlie Cox's fault, because he had a script and this was all given. But still, I felt that was the one weak thing about his portrayal, that we know that the character is blind, we are constantly told that he is blind, there's plenty of puns and everything, but he acts very much as if he is sighted. He doesn't appear slow to move around or anxious, nervous, anything. He seems extremely confident, even in new environments, everything. Whereas the Rex Smith interpretation of the character is very much so a blind man, and they do an excellent job portraying those aspects of it. So I would maybe have liked to seen a little bit more of that in the Netflix series. What do you think?
Yeah, there's definitely a balance to be struck. I mean, I've always kind of felt in the comics he was kind of ridiculously unimpaired by his blindness. I mean, for example, I remember in some Punisher comics, they actually show him with sonar vision. And I'm not sure how often they do that in the Daredevil comics, but it seems to me like they're sort of saying, you know, if he's a dolphin and he can bounce his sounds off objects, then he's not really... I mean, he's almost seeing it just like a game of asteroids. He sees lines, just not textures, and that seems very unimpaired. So in keeping with that, I think the show is all right. But at the same time, I mean, I think we've seen audiences would like to have a little bit of personal drama thrown in, and I think if there were times that his blindness affected him, it would make it certainly more plausible. Of course, Marvel's probably afraid at this point to depress their audiences. You expect a little more, just a hair more reality. I mean, I don't think they want to watch what you would consider to be reality, but certainly something where bits and pieces are heavily inspired by reality.
Yeah, what I thought was handled really well was how they visually presented his blindness. I know there are many who miss the sonar-esque blue screens that visualized his vision, or how he basically how he senses the world from the Ben Affleck movie, but I really liked how they did it here, because he actually doesn't really see anything other than the world of fire, which he described his experience as, but really it's just all the sensory inputs other than vision coming together. So rather than trying to present a vision for the viewer, they just showed what he empathized on. What I really liked was in this one fight scene where the guy is attacking him with a knife, and you see how the camera kind of zooms in on the knife and how he's aware of it. So he gets this 3D image of everything around him that we can't really hope to see, but they kind of captured where his attention is with the camera. And I thought that was a really clever way of handling it.
Sure. And spatially, I think it's important to present that to the viewer, and perhaps more credible than showing it from his point of view with, the asteroids-looking video game type appearance.
Speaking of video game appearance, that's also something they did in the 1989 movie. And there was also the video game appearance, but video games of the time. Just a completely black screen with kind of these greenish radar images, which was quite interesting. But again, he doesn't appear as any kind of visually impaired man. He's someone whose sensory actually gets more input than us sighted.
Sure, it's the old trope about losing one sense and having all the others heightened. And they did a lot with smell in this too. I mean, he's talking about copper being in the air. Well, I mean, maybe that's just his fancy way of saying blood, which I think we can all smell a little bit if there's a lot of it. But yeah, not so common. I mean, it seems like even just a little bit was enough for him.
Yeah, like a human shark.
Well, I can only imagine how the agony Daredevil would be in if he was spending time with a farter.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Suffice to say, Charlie Cox did a good job then.
Oh yeah, I had no complaints. I mean, he's a little wooden, but I think Daredevil himself is actually a little wooden when he's interacting with other people. It's not his most natural thing in the world. Though he's a little more natural with communicating with other people than Kingpin is, at least as portrayed in this series.
I really liked how he was portrayed in this one by Vincent D'Onofrio, who plays them. They didn't use the name Kingpin, only Wilson Fisk, and I thought that his performance was really interesting, different from the comics in a sense, but really captivating, because the impression that I was left with is that, in a sense, he's a man-child. That's how he sees himself. We see that scene when he's alone, and this isn't really a spoiler, I hope, but there is this one scene where he sees himself in the mirror, and the way he sees himself is how he was as an 11, 12-year-old boy, and that is how he sometimes acts in anger.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I thought that was a really interesting way to handle the character that makes him a much more conflicted, in a sense damaged character than what we see in the comics. But at the same time, I never really liked the Kingpin of the comics. He was just like this really big, dangerous fat dude. Whereas, yeah, to me it made him really boring, and I just wish the Punisher would just kill him already and be done with it, because I thought he was really boring and an uninteresting villain.
You must have really liked his appearance in Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe.
Oh yeah, that was awesome. That was awesome. I loved that one.
Just him being a big fat guy. I mean, I could have nightmares about the scene where he's basically fallen over on the Punisher, and Punisher's still shooting him. Oh man, what a grisly moment.
Yeah, that was fantastic. That was fantastic. But generally, I've never really liked him, not even in the Frank Miller Daredevil comics. That is, I liked him for the role he had in those stories, but I was never really intrigued by him as a character. And that's the same with the 2003 movie. I wasn't really a fan of how the character was portrayed there. But in the guise of Vincent D'Onofrio, I think he's really interesting. He's actually the most interesting character in the whole show. More interesting in some senses than Daredevil himself.
I agree. I think that's almost intentional. You know, you kind of, as a director, I think, try to anticipate breakout performances, and a villain role is always that place you want to keep your eye. I mean, it's sort of like Silence of the Lambs. I mean, who's the most captivating character in that? Clarice Starling or Hannibal Lecter? I don't think it's Starling most people walk away thinking about.
Exactly. What I thought was so brilliant here as well, though, is how the character was introduced. And this then is a major contrast to the 2003 movie, where we basically see the camera zoom up the skyscraper where his head office is, with the gangster rap in the background telling us what a gangster this guy is. Whereas here, in this Netflix series, is the polar opposite approach. We are introduced to him as a man in an art gallery who is really captivated by this one image, and later the art curator, who we will get back to. And then we see him from a more emotional, vulnerable side. That is how we are introduced to him. This man who is really captivated by this piece of art that to everyone else is just shades of white, but he sees something here that we don't. And he's also really captivated by this curator, and he falls head over heels, and he wants to do everything to get to know her better. And we see him fidgeting, awkward, a little bit shy. This awkward, in a sense, teen romance that he's going through. And only afterwards we get to see him as a mobster. Then we see how ferocious and how dangerous this guy can be when provoked. And I thought that was a really interesting way to introduce the character. So we see him as a vulnerable human first and foremost, and then as a dangerous, unhinged mob leader second.
Yeah, my theory on him in that painting, I kind of think he tends to see himself as, you know, there's a joke, that Vanessa makes, the art curator, about the painting, which is that it's a rabbit in a snowstorm. And in a way, maybe it's not a direct thought he has, but I think at least the viewer can kind of see him as that rabbit in the snowstorm, somebody who's overlooked, somebody who's invisible.
Exactly. And that all goes back to how multifaceted and layered this character is, which is why he's so interesting.
You know, I had seen some discussion online, and it's actually a thought that I had myself. Do you think that he's intended to be autistic? in this particular portrayal.
Possibly. I'm not convinced he is. I don't know all that much about autism. If he is an autist indeed, he's a very high-functioning autist.
Right.
My personal take on it is that he is someone who's traumatized from childhood experiences. And we see this in the series, that there was a very traumatic and formative early incident when he was around 11, 12 years old. And I think that his development, in a sense, stopped there. Of course, he kept to learn more. He gathered more and more information about the world and how the world works. But personality-wise, I think that he kind of stopped right there. There his development was stunted, and he remained this vulnerable, hurt little 11, 12-year-old. That is my own take on it. But of course, if you read a little bit more about autism, which I haven't really done just yet, then maybe. I certainly cannot rule that out.
What makes me think possibly is that, this is a wealthy guy. This is somebody who's used to taking power, and he obviously didn't inherit this money. Could be that they explain it in the show, and I just haven't gotten through those last few episodes where his money came from.
They don't.
In the comics, he takes it. He kills his boss and inherits his wealth and uses it to increase his power. So usually, when you think of people who are wealthy, you think of people who are good communicators. They're good at getting other people to work with them. But he's actually fairly poor at communicating with other people. I mean, his voice is he sort of pauses, has to think about what he's going to say. Each word comes very far apart.
He seems very dependent on his personal communicator, Wesley.
That's their way of saying it. That's his way of being able to interact with the world, is through this other person.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't really considered that until this moment, but of course that is some excellent observations right there. Because then you have Wesley, who is also a very interesting character, who follows this man for whatever reason. We don't know why. We don't know their backstory. I would love to learn more about it, but clearly Wesley follows Fisk for some reason, and it's Wesley who works as the liaison, the one who communicates the messages that Wilson intends to convey, but possibly is incapable of doing himself to his underlings.
Or very uncomfortable with it, at least. And the important thing to realize about autism is it doesn't actually impact people's intelligence, especially high-functioning autistic. It's just that, there's rules, there's boundaries, they get hamstrung by things that would be a little more casual for people. And there's a great need for order, structuring, and I see all that in Kingpin.
From what I gather, many high-functioning autists are far more intelligent than the average lot. And I think this easily could be the case with Wilson Fisk, since he clearly is intelligent just from having gotten to be in the place where he is, to be in a position where he can take the power, he can take charge, he can take all the wealth. That requires some level of intelligence.
Absolutely.
And he clearly has it.
Here's another element of this show. What do you think of the supporting cast? It doesn't seem like they get enough screen time to really become completely interesting. And in fact, I don't know, early on it seems to me like they when they do try to give the characters screen time, they kind of flounder a little bit. For example, with Foggy Nelson and Karen Page, the second episode where they're running around in the middle of the night drunk, that could not end quickly enough for me. What was your take on that?
I think that they were a little bit undefined, but I think that the single most interesting supporting character is actually Vanessa, the future Miss Wilson Fisk. I thought that she was the absolutely most interesting side or supporting cast, even if she was the least developed. And that's part of why she was so interesting to me, because think about it, she is an art curator, and we know from her conversation that she has had plenty of men who have been interested in her before, princes and oil sheiks and what have you not. Yet she is attracted to Wilson Fisk, and she knows he's a mobster, she knows this is a killer, and still she is intrigued by him. And it's not just that he has money and power, because her previous suitors have had that too, but she's attracted to him. Why? There is something there, something that we have not yet seen. And I thought that was really intriguing.
I think there's the kind of the classic good battle for good and evil in her heart. I mean, we would like to think that somebody high-minded, and she clearly is very high-minded. She's socially aware, you know, kind of a sort of liberal figure, and in a vague sense. I don't feel like the show delves particularly into politics, but you kind of get that notion. And that there's been a battle like about this in her head for a long time, and I think maybe she's a little more prone to a character flaw of being attracted to power if that power comes from a negative source. This back and forth battle is clearly played out on the screen, and if she was thoroughly, truly, steadfastly a do-gooder, I don't think she would have seen Wilson Fisk a second time after witnessing what she did at their first date. But yet she came back, at least to hear what he had to say.
I don't think she's a do-gooder at all. I think that specifically that he has power, but he uses it negatively. That might be one of the reasons why she's attracted to him, because she's presumably been with other powerful men before, but she didn't stay with them. But this is the guy she comes back to, and I thought that was interesting. But there are plenty more supporting casts. Because, as you mentioned, Foggy and Karen Page.
I like them better in small doses than I do in large doses. I really enjoyed Karen Page in the first episode, even though I sort of cruelly observed that she had a mustache in the first episode. I enjoyed her in that first episode in terms of her acting far more than I have in the later episodes. I think maybe the secretary trope is a little played out.
Yeah, maybe. Still, I think there was an interesting dynamic between her and Foggy and Matt. I was actually really impressed with Eldon Henson as Foggy Nelson, because you're right in that they are certainly best in small doses, but in the right doses I thought they were both excellent, and I really liked the chemistry between Foggy and Matt. And I think that elevated the show a great deal.
Foggy's kind of tricky for me. I've never really liked his character, I suppose. I mean, from the comics, he was kind of, I don't know, sort of an older Jimmy Olsen, you know, sort of gets himself into trouble, doesn't know when to quit.
I think that's one of the reasons why I liked this Netflix interpretation, because he's similar to the comics, but again, he's different. He's much more fun, much more jovial, and I think this is more fitting for the character, someone which is more natural for Matt Murdock to play off against. Where you have two very different personalities who are still friends, and the way that they play against each other is far more interesting than what you have in the comics, which I think is one of the reasons why Foggy Nelson can come across as so boring on the page, because he's not really an interesting character there.
He's interesting on the page in the sense that he gets into trouble all the time. I mean, you're sort of just watching, saying to yourself, well, what is Foggy going to do to screw this up now? But beyond that, I pretty much hate every interaction he has on the show.
Really? Okay, we have to agree to disagree on that one. I thought he was really good. But I've seen also online that many are in disagreement.
Speaking of translating from the comics, how did you feel Ben Urich came across from the comics?
Very interesting. A bit unexpected, to be honest, because Ben Urich has always been this fairly tough as nails, really professional journalist, but this version seemed much more cynical than I've ever seen him in the comics.
Yeah, I agree. I guess they threw me for a loop at first, because his first meeting with Karen Page, he pretty much tells her to get lost and that they're not going to be able to do any good anyway, making you think that maybe he won't even pursue it. But then I kind of enjoyed that they came back and they were like, no, he was just kind of trying to keep her away from it, that he himself wanted to do something about it and didn't know any better, really. So in that sense, they preserved his willingness to fight against stronger powers. But at the same time, I agree, you know, he's kind of a character who has sort of a shimmer of eternal optimism in the comics. Maybe not overwhelming like he's Mickey Mouse or something, but certainly to the point that he's a real guy living in the real world who really wants to do good and isn't going to let any setback stop him. And in that sense, he's the same, but he's different.
Yeah, he's the same in terms of the goal, but I think he's different in terms of the attitude and the approach. Because as you said, in the comics, he's this really positive guy. here I would say he's anything but. There's nothing positive about Ben Urich as portrayed by Vondie Curtis Hall. And he does what he does, I think, for a different reason. This character in the Netflix series is an idealist. He is someone who knows that things probably aren't going to be much better. He knows he can't have all that big an impact. Of course, you can have these small impacts, you can have these stories that make a difference here and there, but in the end, I think he does what he does out of a principle. He's an idealist, and optimism really doesn't come into it. He's the most cynical person you can possibly find, but he does what he does because it's right. That's my take on it anyway.
I think the battle for cynicism here may be fought between Matt himself and Ben Urich. Matt himself seems fairly cynical. I mean, again, never stopping, never allowing himself to be deterred, but definitely wondering if what he's doing is going to have an impact, to the point where he openly quibbles about it. You know, that he'll state clearly, plainly that he doesn't know what he needs to do, doesn't know if it's the right thing to do. Whereas Urich, he's older. You know, he kind of has already figured all this out for himself.
Yeah, I think that you hit on a key point right there, because I think that Ben Urich here, when he was young, he was probably very much like Matt Murdock. And Matt Murdock, when he grows older, more experienced, when he figures the world out a little bit more, I think he's going to become more like Ben Urich.
Yeah, I
think that's probably a development that the character is going to go over the course of future seasons. I think we're going to see him become closer to what Ben Urich was.
You know who I'd really like to see more of in future seasons? I was totally impressed. I really enjoyed Scott Glenn as Stick.
Oh, he was awesome. He was terrific.
I want to say he's evil. He's not really evil. I know that there's sort of a method to what he's doing, but at the same time, I see some of the Punisher in him. One of my very favorite characters, which is that he sees that things should be a certain way, and he'll cut your head off to make it that way.
Yeah, not only that, because he does what he does, which he thinks is right, and good and evil, I think, are dimensions that, as far as he is concerned, doesn't really come into it, doesn't enter the picture. For him, I think it's a matter of this needs doing, so I'm going to do it. And that's just how it is. He also seems like a very cynical man, not concerned with good or evil, just doing what he feels is right, or what is right for him, or what suits his ends.
It kind of makes me think about how, when it comes to evil and not seeing evil as a real thing. I mean, it sort of brings to mind the quote that the devil's greatest trick was convincing the world he didn't exist. And so maybe that's a trap that Stick has sort of fallen into, that by not recognizing good and evil, he'll miss it completely when he is acting out of evil.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also something we saw. Now we can come back to that in the spoiler section. But anyway, yes, I think that's very accurate, that he's very morally ambiguous, to say that least.
Did you enjoy Rosario Dawson in the show? I didn't even realize she was in it until several episodes in, and I said, well, boy, she looks familiar.
I loved Rosario Dawson in this show, and second only to Vanessa, hers was my favorite character in it, and she had such a great chemistry with Charlie Cox. So I would have liked to see many more scenes with the two of them together. And she was very different compared to what we usually see her as. We usually see her as this femme fatale. That is the more stereotypical Rosario Dawson performance.
Right.
My first impression of Rosario Dawson was Sin City, and I think that many noticed her there, and her future performances are to some extent colored by that, which is why she really breaks from her usual norm in this one, playing a much more vulnerable, but in some ways even stronger character than her previous ones for it.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it a lot. It was kind of nice seeing her. I mean, you can almost imagine. It's funny because both roles seem very natural to her. She seems, I had no qualms with her performance in Sin City, but here she also seems very naturally warm, easy to relate to. Not somebody you'd want to criticize or attack, just somebody good trying to get by.
Absolutely, so she was excellent. And I really hope to see her back in future seasons, because she was excellent. This is one of her best performances, and I really enjoyed her character and the character's part in the series. So, what do you think about the series overall, the quality of the storyline and the shooting?
You know, I like it. I think it's much more in line with an HBO quality show. You know, I mean, of course, that always leads me to talk about Game of Thrones, and I wouldn't want to get into that comparison too much because they are very different beasts. But I think when we're talking about the shooting, finding the angles, which, you know, are a constant fight a director has on the set, is that they don't want to just put the shot straight forward. I mean, you can do that if you have to, just show the things that are happening. I mean, that doesn't sound very complicated. But when it comes to capturing your audiences, you have to try to do more interesting things. And I think the camera angles on this show represent that they were thinking very much about trying to find interesting camera angles that don't completely ruin the action.
Absolutely. Visually, I thought the show was stunning. And that is not only the composition of the shots, but also the choice of colors. The very simple primary colors, very much like the comics themselves, that where you had these 3 strong primary colors often dominating one scene. So it's very dark and murky, but at the same time, it fits within an overall color scheme. It reminded me in some sense of very early Michael Mann, which of course is a great thing.
How about the fight scenes? Have they been memorable to you? I mean, I know there's definitely that one fight scene in the hallway with the Russians that everybody's talking about.
Oh, absolutely. The fight scenes I thought are excellent. Some of the best fight scenes I have seen in any comic book property, be it movie, TV series, or animation for that matter. And especially the corridor fight, which everyone is raving about for a reason, because that is sheer brilliance. Brutal and to the point, and you can feel how exhausted the actors must have been. It really comes across on screen. So that's brilliant. And not just that, but all the other fights, you can kind of like feel how intense and how brutal they are. And again, I'd like to contrast with the 2003 Ben Affleck movie, where I thought the fight scenes for the most part were okay, apart from the fight scenes between Wilson Fisk, there played by Michael Clarke Duncan, and Ben Affleck's Daredevil, which came across as a joke, especially when Michael Clarke Duncan threw Ben Affleck across the room, and he's like moving obviously on a wire along a trajectory and at a speed that would never happen in reality, which really took me out of those fight scenes.
I think that was my problem with that movie in general, is that those fight scenes didn't feel very good. There was way too much wire work involved. I mean,
exactly.
Especially early on, and there's a fight with several gangsters. Boy, I'm drawing sort of a blank on the plot of why. I know he was defending somebody in court, and then that was tied into this criminal getting away with something, and he went to go chase him down. I just wish I could remember more about it. It's probably been a decade since I've seen it, but overall, no, I don't remember enjoying the fight scenes at all. They didn't even want to show you what was happening on screen. They were just dark. The camera spun around too much. It wanted to be more flashy than the substance warranted.
Yeah, and the times when they did show what was happening, it would have been better if they didn't. But here,
yeah,
I think is excellent. It's real, because here, for one thing, you see what is happening, but it also comes across as real. So these are some of the best, possibly the best staged and choreographed fight scenes I have seen in any superhero production ever.
Which I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised about, because I would think that would be something Stephen DeKnight would bring with him.
He was working on Spartacus, yes, absolutely. And there is some level of cartoony violence, but there's none of that here. The fight scenes here are actually far more real and down to earth than anything in Spartacus. But what you have in common is the sheer brutality. There is a certain level of brutality in Spartacus, even if it's cartoony and everything, that is unmatched most other places, and you see that come through here, that sheer brutality, only much more real in Daredevil.
Which ties in perfectly with the comics. I mean, that's the impression I always had from the comics, especially the Frank Miller ones, that they were trying not to tone down the violence. And you know, that sounds simple to say, but it's hard to do. I mean, when you throw a punch in a movie, most of the time it's the old cowboy cliche of, you know, somebody swings, they're a foot away with their fist, yet somebody goes flying. You know, it's not. I think a much worse scenario and a much more realistic scenario is that nobody goes flying, and that several direct follow-up punches have to be thrown. It's just two people people badly injuring each other, not a what you would think of as a movie fight.
And that is also something that I liked here, that every punch, every grapple, every attack, it all had consequences. You see bones breaking, and you see also what a mess Daredevil is after some of the fights where he really gets beaten up. He needs time to recover, he needs to be stitched up. Most other comparable movies and series, the hero just brushes it off, but not here. Here he actually gets hurt, and that also goes back to the fight scenes being so real in a sense. They have an impact. You get hurt. So overall, though, are you excited about the future season?
Yeah, I think that comes up after every episode. We're just sitting there kind of in awe, like, wow, we have to get another season of this. And, it's kind of scary to me because Marvel has not actually indicated they want to do a second season of this. It sounds almost like they want to use additional characters as additional seasons, in a sense. Like maybe every 6 months or every 4 months or something, we're going to get another one of these characters. We've got Luke Cage lined up and Jessica Jones, I think.
Right now, I think they're filming both Jessica Jones and Iron Fist. I'm not sure if they film one and then the other, or they film both at the same time, but those two are scheduled to come out next, and then it's Iron Fist before they all meet up with Daredevil and everyone else in the Defenders miniseries. Because from what I gather, what was sold to Netflix at the time was a 60-episode total package comprised of the 4 series. But I think and I hope there is room for a second season of Daredevil, because after I'd seen the last episode, I wasn't hungry for Luke Cage or Jessica Jones. I was hungry for season 2 of Daredevil.
I could not feel any more the same. I just want more Daredevil.
But hopefully,
which is surprising for me to say, because as a Punisher fan, I've kind of been somewhat opposed to Daredevil for a long time. He seems irritating and petty, and like you said earlier, holier than thou. But that they have turned me into a casual Daredevil fan, that's a trick.
That is more than a trick. That is an accomplishment. When you have someone who knows Daredevil primarily through the Punisher, and you make that person into a Daredevil fan, then you have really pulled a rabbit out of the hat, and massive kudos to Marvel for pulling that off. But regarding season 2, there is some level of speculation. And you have this infamous Sony hack, and one of the things which actually are indicated in it is that Stephen DeKnight, the original showrunner, actually had the synopsis ready for season 2. Of course, we don't know how that is going to play out, or if they're going to make a season 2, if it's going to be made now in between the other series, or if it will come after the Defenders. But I at least hope that there's going to be a season 2 announcement over the not too distant future, because Netflix, they don't release their numbers, but just judging by social media and the reviews both by fans and critics alike, Daredevil appears to be a huge hit, and I can't imagine anyone not wanting a season 2.
Yeah. So what do you want to put a score on this?
If I were to score it, I would say, it's a little bit difficult to say, but I think I'd give it an 8 out of 10. And when you view the series as a whole, I would say this is at the Dark Knight level accomplishment. Not just because of the series as a whole, but for what it achieves. Because what this does is that it leaves the door wide open for more of Marvel's dark characters. And that, of course, is what we at Midnight's Edge are all about.
What would you take away those 2 points for?
Well, it's not that I would take them away. It would have to be something really earth-shattering to get them to begin with. Because to me, I wouldn't give a 10 out of 10 unless it's something really, really monumental. What I would take away, or if not really take away, but not award a full 10 out of 10, is that I thought that at some points the pacing was a little bit off. There were times when the pace could have been handled better. As you mentioned, there were some scenes with for instance, Foggy and the Secretary that dragged on a little bit too much. And the series is very short and sweet, just 13 episodes, but at the same time I thought there was a little bit pandering sometimes in there. It could have been a little bit more to the point. And as we also mentioned earlier, the handling of Daredevil being blind, I would have liked to see a little bit more emphasis on that, how that affects him on a day-to-day basis. How about you?
Well, I think I would mostly take away if I was to take away points, I would also take it away for the pacing. I really liked the interaction between Matt and Claire. I really liked it, but I think they spent too much time on it in that second episode, much like they spent too much time on Foggy and Karen in the second episode. So maybe that, just for that one episode, I would say this show gets 5 out of 6 blind hotshot lawyers.
That seems quite fair.
Well, I think that'll just about do it for our Daredevil episode, but tune in more. We definitely got more on the way. Be sure to check out midnightsedge.net. We'll have the link right there in the description for you.
And leave us a comment and tell us what you think.
All right, so till next time, it's Kevin
and Andre.